Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. I'm continuing my look at World Championship Blunders, and I'm moving on to the match between Alexander Alekhine and Max Euwe in 1935, their first match. So Alekhine was the defending champion. He was 43 years old when this match was played. Euwe younger, he was, 34 years old. Yeah, he was born in 1901. That, I think, was an important factor in this match. Alekhine, well, by all accounts, he was even intoxicated during some of the games. He enjoyed a drink. And this match was a peripatetic match. They played in different locations around the Netherlands, and that must have been tiring in itself for both players, but particularly the older man, Alekhine. Anyway, I would like to look at game 24. Now, it was absolutely even to this point. They both scored 7 wins each. The winner of the match would be, the first to 15.5 points, basically. It was best of 30, plus you had to score 6 wins. Well, they'd both already scored 7 wins, so it's basically a best of 30 match. It's even, and this is game 24. Max Euwe with the white pieces. That was a rambling introduction, wasn't it? Well, it's a Dutch defence. How appropriate for this match. And, well, the Dutch is a contentious opening. Basically, when you advance your f-pawn, it can be dangerous in the long term for black because the king can become exposed. However, it does mean that sometimes you can launch that f-pawn down the board to attack your opponent's king here. To be honest, I don't want to dwell too much on the early stages of this game because the blunder occurs right at the end of the game. I mean, this is all pretty standard stuff, you could say, but here is where it starts to explode. Alekhine goes in for bishop takes pawn, which is risky because his centre disappears, and then he took on b2. Now, I think a reasonable way for white to play this is just to push that bishop back. Play queen c2. No, white has sacked a pawn, but black's kingside looks pretty vulnerable, and you can see that these pieces are still on their starting blocks. You know, I think white has good compensation for the pawn there. But Euwe basically recovers the pawn straight away with bishop takes pawn check. Queen c2, so double attack, check, and then takes the bishop on the next turn. That's also a tempting continuation for white because material is even, but there aren't many pieces around black's king. So the question is, can white shift the pieces over to the king side to get an attack? I think this is a tempting move. f4 with the idea knight f3 to g5 and then e4. I mean, that's a dangerous initiative for white. Euwe played knight f3, which also can't be too bad. d6, I mean, again, one could just plonk this knight on g5. Euwe played c5. He didn't want to be sort of left with that weak pawn, but over these next few moves, Alekhine with black finds his feet. The queen protects the pawn here. I mean, h4 is still an interesting move to play knight g5, but rook d1. Basically, Alekhine succeeds in consolidating with black. This bishop finds its way to an excellent diagonal. The queen is close enough to the king so that there isn't actually too much danger. Once again, I think h4 is maybe a reasonable move, but I think black is okay. Euwe went for queen g6, so he's still trying to prove that he has an attack here. But Alekhine manages to counter. and rook d8. You can see black's pieces are really well coordinated now. And it's basically too little too late for white. Alekhine takes the initiative, knight d4. Watch out, if that knight moves, there's going to be well, destruction on f2. In fact, after this little transaction, Euwe can survive this position. We'll see why in a second. Rook takes f3 should be a draw. It's complicated, but I want to cut to what happened in the game. So rook takes rook check. So we've got a simplification. Queen f7. So a pawn endgame is now forced. Queen takes here. Right. I'm going to flip the board. I don't do this very often, but I'm going to flip the board and ask you, how would you play with black in this position? Black has a winning position. What should Alekhine play? In fact, Alekhine got it right. This isn't the blunder. That comes a bit later on. What should black play? You can always pause the video if you want to have a detailed look. The winning move here is pawn to e5. And that basically cripples white's kingside pawn majority. This is correct. I'm going to flip it back. King f1. Yeah, so basically this move e5 prevents white from playing f4. If instead, let's say b5, then f4. King comes across to cover those pawns. But white's kingside majority is active, and it's impossible for black's king to get through to attack these pawns, and that should be a draw. But e5 is a clever move, which means if f4 you can take and the pawns are shattered. So this is a winning position. Okay, I'm going to flip the board again. Okay, so here is where black can win. And here is where Alekhine with black got it horribly wrong. He was not in time pressure, apparently. He had enough time to calculate this one out. But for a player of Alekhine's experience, ability, and calculating skills, this is a dreadful blunder. He got it wrong. He was just too casual here. If you want to play a5 here, congratulations, that is the winning move. But Alekhine played c5, and that was a mistake. Let's flip the board. Why is it a mistake? Well, after king e3, the players actually just agreed a draw. The idea is to play pawn to f4, and that basically gives white a living, breathing, working kingside pawn majority that black's king has to look after. So for example, king f7, f4, white has time to do this. White's king can get back to stop those pawns, and you can see that here those pawns, those white pawns could look after themselves, because after king here, if the king takes the pawn then these pawns go through. And basically, well, this is just a draw. The black king has to look after these pawns. The white king has to look after these pawns. It's a draw. So king e3 by Euwe with the idea f4 was the drawing idea. But let's go back to this position. So c5 was the blunder. So what should Alekhine play? Well, he should have played pawn to a5. And the point is this: if white tries to straighten out his pawns with king e3 and f4, he's just too late. Watch this: king e3, a4, f4, takes, b4. The king is too far away. b3 and a3, they're going to go through. Let's just show this. Takes, now not pawn takes, but a3. And it's a girl. So after a5, basically the king has to come over to stop the outside pawn queening. And these pawns can protect themselves, basically. Okay, so what about white's kingside pawn majority? Well, the difference is that, well, with just one pawn, because this is basically a double pawn, it's useless, these pawns are just not potent enough. So, for example, if g5, king e6, and actually the king just marches in and takes this pawn here. So let's see, if h5, well, the pawns aren't going very far, basically. Yeah, if h5, king f6, basically those pawns get broken up after this, and e4, and that pawn will be taken. Let me see, let's come back. So, well, let's give a, for example, how this works in practice. Let's advance the king. Or let's show what happens with h5, actually. Sorry, I'm toing and froing here. But basically, white's king gets forced back. If this pawn ever advances, then black's king will come back and can scoop them up. So basically, these pawns have to wait here. King here, c4. Okay, if g5, in this case, the pawns are far enough advanced, and these go through. I mean, it's really not that difficult to calculate. Or in this position, is there anything better? No, not really. Yeah, c2, and basically the pawn goes home. I mean, there are various scenarios here where, I mean, white can try various things after a5, but the point is that white does not have time to straighten out the pawns with f4. a5 is a winning move. Now, you might say this isn't some horrible blunder by black. This is all terribly technical, and but I think for someone like Alekhine, if you have the time to just forget about king e3 and f4 is actually a really bad mistake. It was just a very, very careless move. So yeah, I think it's a really bad blunder actually, and a5 is a pretty simple win. And in fact, the fact that Euwe held the draw here was really significant in the match. So it meant the scores were still level, but that blunder really shook Alekhine, and he didn't recover. And Euwe went on to win the match. So yeah, it had enormous significance. It's not just in itself. It's a terrible mistake, but it was significant for the match. There you go. That was a little bit complex. I hope you stuck with it. In the next one I'm going to show you, which is again with the same players, but in the 1937 match, it's much, much clearer what was overlooked. But anyway, I hope you got something from that.